"It hurts down there, but don't stop," the beautiful woman said to the lonely cowboy. The sun was low over the wide-open plains, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. John, a cowboy in his mid-30s, rode slowly along the dusty trail, feeling the ache in his muscles and the emptiness in his heart. His small farm had been struggling for months, and the isolation of the countryside weighed heavily on him. Each day felt longer than the last, and each night brought with it the cold echo of silence. He loved the land, loved the rhythm of life outdoors, but there was a loneliness that no horse, no barn, and no open sky could fill. John had once been part of a small community in a nearby town. People knew him as a hard worker and a kind man, always ready to lend a hand. But years of drought, poor harvests, and the slow disappearance of family and friends had left him almost entirely alone. Occasionally, travelers would pass by, exchanging brief smiles or polite nods, but deep conversations were rare. He missed human connection, the warmth of friendship, and the simple comfort of being understood. One evening, as John prepared to set up camp near a small creek, he noticed a faint figure moving along the opposite bank. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but as he looked closer, he saw a woman struggling to carry a large bundle of firewood. Her hair shone in the sunlight, golden and bright, and there was a determined look in her eyes. She seemed strong, yet a little weary. Something about her presence stirred a strange mixture of curiosity and caution in John. He decided to approach slowly. "Hello there," he called softly, careful not to startle her. The woman looked up and smiled faintly. "Hello," she replied. Her voice was calm, yet carried a weight, as if she had been carrying more than just firewood. "I didn't expect anyone to be around here." John nodded, shifting his saddle to get more comfortable. "This place is quiet most of the time. I live not far from here. Are you traveling alone?" She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes, I'm moving between towns, helping where I can. It's not easy, but I manage." There was a pause, and then she added almost to herself, "Sometimes it hurts more than it should." John felt an unexpected pang of empathy. He understood that feeling too well. He dismounted and offered a hand to help her with the bundle. She accepted, and together they carried the firewood to a small clearing. As the fire crackled and the evening shadows grew longer, they talked quietly. She introduced herself as Clara. She spoke of the difficulties she had faced, caring for her younger siblings after losing her parents, traveling to find work, and struggling with moments of doubt and fear. John listened carefully, feeling a rare sense of connection. He had spent so long in silence that the sound of another person's voice, speaking honestly about hardships, felt like a balm to his spirit. Clara noticed John's tired eyes and the roughness of his hands. "You've been working hard," she said gently. "But it seems like the work isn't the only thing wearing you down." John laughed softly, a little embarrassed. "You could say that. Life has been lonely lately. I wake up each day with the hope that something will change, but most days it doesn't." Clara nodded, understanding more than she let on. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "we have to keep going even when it hurts, even when we feel like giving up. That's how we grow stronger even if we don't see it yet." The words struck John deeply. He had heard encouragement before, but Clara spoke with a sincerity that made the sentiment real. There was no pity, no judgment, just a recognition that life could be hard and that it was okay to struggle. They sat together in silence for a while, watching the firelight dance across their faces. For John, it was the first time in years that he had felt a sense of calm, a small but meaningful reprieve from the constant tension of his daily life. Clara's presence was a reminder that human connection could exist even in the most unexpected places. As the night deepened, John found himself opening up more than he usually would. He spoke about his farm, about the drought, and about the worry that his hard work might never be enough. Clara listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or offering a thoughtful word. "You're not as alone as you think," she said at one point. "Sometimes help comes from places you don't expect, and sometimes it comes from people who understand your pain, even if they don't know everything." John felt a strange warmth at her words. He realized that for years he had shut himself off, believing that no one could truly understand the life he led. Yet here was someone, a stranger in many ways, who seemed to understand just enough to make the burden lighter. By the time the fire had burned down to glowing embers, they had shared stories of their pasts, their fears, and their hopes. There was no rush, no pressure, just the simple act of two people acknowledging each other's existence. For John, this was more than companionship. It was a reminder that the world still held moments of kindness, even in the midst of hardship. Clara stood and stretched. "I should get some rest before the road calls me again," she said. "But remember what I told you. Keep going even when it hurts. Don't stop. There's strength in persistence, and sometimes the smallest steps can lead to the biggest changes." John nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in his mind. "I'll try," he said, with a quiet determination he hadn't felt in a long time. They parted ways under the starlit sky, each walking toward their own path. But John carried with him a renewed sense of hope. The loneliness that had felt so heavy now seemed lighter, tempered by the understanding that even a brief connection could leave a lasting impact. He realized that pain was a part of life, but it didn't have to define him. With persistence, patience, and a willingness to accept support, he could face the challenges ahead. As he settled down to sleep under the open sky, John reflected on the unexpected encounter. Clara's words echoed in his mind, simple yet profound. He thought about the journey ahead, both the physical journey across the plains and the emotional journey of rebuilding his life. There would be struggles, no doubt, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face them. The night was calm, with only the soft rustle of leaves and the distant cry of an owl breaking the silence. John closed his eyes and allowed himself to imagine a future where the pain was still there, but where it was balanced by moments of connection, understanding, and hope. Somewhere not too far away, Clara also looked up at the stars. She had no idea what impact her words would have, but she felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that she had shared a little light in someone else's darkness. And so, under the vast expanse of the night sky, two lives continued their separate paths, yet connected by a fleeting moment of empathy, courage, and the simple human truth that sometimes it hurts, but we must not stop. The next morning, John woke before the sun, the sky still painted in pale shades of pink and blue. The air was crisp, and the dew made the grass sparkle like tiny diamonds. For the first time in a long while, he felt a small sense of excitement. Not the excitement of fun or celebration, but a quiet, steady anticipation, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, something could change. He saddled his horse and rode toward his farm, thinking about Clara and her words. "Keep going, even when it hurts. Don't stop." He repeated them silently, letting them sink into his mind. The words were like a gentle push, a reminder that even if the road ahead was hard, he could continue. When he reached the farm, the first thing he noticed was the damage from the previous night's storm. Some of the fences were broken, the gate to the chicken coop had been torn loose, and several of the smaller plants in his vegetable patch were flattened by the wind. The sight made him sigh. He had so little help, and the work seemed endless. But instead of giving in to despair, John started working immediately. He repaired the fences, gathered the chickens, and tied up the plants that could still be saved. Each small task felt heavier than it would have years ago, but he forced himself to keep going, thinking of Clara's encouragement. Step by step, he rebuilt what the storm had destroyed, and with every action he felt a growing sense of accomplishment. By midday, John paused to rest. He leaned against a tree and wiped the sweat from his forehead. The land was still far from perfect, but at least it was functional. He realized that persistence wasn't just about large victories. It was about the small acts done consistently, even when no one was watching. Later that afternoon, as he tended to his cattle, he noticed smoke rising from the edge of the nearby forest. Curious and slightly concerned, he rode toward it. As he approached, he saw a small fire burning, seemingly out of control. Without hesitation, he jumped off his horse and ran toward the flames with a bucket of water. By the time he managed to control it, the fire had scorched a small patch of grass, but the larger area had been saved. Exhausted, he leaned against a tree and watched the smoke rise. In that moment, he realized something important. Challenges would always appear, but the way he faced them mattered more than the difficulties themselves. Each time he persevered, he grew stronger, more confident in his ability to handle whatever came next. That evening, John returned home to find a letter lying at his doorstep. It was from a neighbor, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. The letter was short but warm, inviting him to a small gathering in town that weekend. At first, John felt a wave of hesitation. He had grown accustomed to being alone, and the idea of socializing seemed daunting. But then he remembered Clara's words about persistence and connection. Maybe this was another small step toward rebuilding his life. On the following days, John continued his routine, but with a new sense of purpose. He mended broken tools, fed the animals carefully, and even experimented with planting a few new crops that had a better chance of surviving the harsh climate. Each success, no matter how minor, gave him a little more hope. During these days, he also found himself thinking of Clara often. He didn't know where she had gone or if he would ever see her again, but her words had sparked something within him. He realized that even brief moments of understanding or kindness could have a profound effect on a person's life. The memory of her encouragement helped him through the most exhausting tasks and gave him the courage to face small failures without giving in to despair. As the weekend approached, John decided to accept the neighbor's invitation. He dressed carefully, choosing a clean shirt and making sure his boots were polished. When he arrived in town, he was surprised to see so many familiar faces. People smiled and greeted him warmly, remembering the hardworking cowboy he had always been. The gathering was simple but full of warmth. Stories were shared, laughter filled the air, and John found himself genuinely enjoying the company of others. For the first time in years, he didn't feel isolated. He realized that human connection, even in small doses, could lift the spirit more than any physical labor or solitary reflection. During the gathering, John met an older man named Henry, who had been a mentor to many young farmers in the region. Henry observed John carefully and then said, "You've got good hands, son, but sometimes life needs more than hard work. It needs courage to ask for help and wisdom to learn from others." John nodded, feeling the truth in the man's words. He had been too proud, too accustomed to handling everything alone. But now he began to understand that reaching out, even slightly, could open doors he had long ignored. After the gathering, John walked home under the starry sky, feeling a lightness in his chest. For the first time, loneliness didn't feel permanent. There were people around who cared, and there were small actions he could take to improve his life. Back on his farm, he continued with his work, but now he also began making small improvements to his daily routine. He created a proper schedule for his crops, set aside time to repair old structures, and even began writing a journal to record his progress. The simple act of writing helped him see how far he had come and what he could accomplish with continued effort. One evening, while checking on the animals, John noticed a young boy struggling to carry a sack of grain near the road. Without thinking, he ran over to help. Together, they moved the sack to the barn. The boy introduced himself as Tom and explained that his father had been ill and he needed help managing the farm. John realized that helping Tom was more than an act of kindness. It was an opportunity to pass on the lessons he had learned about persistence, responsibility, and patience. He offered to teach Tom how to care for the animals and tend the crops, and the boy eagerly accepted. Over the next few days, John and Tom worked side by side. They repaired fences, fed the animals, and planted new seeds. John found that teaching someone else not only helped the boy but also reinforced his own knowledge and confidence. There was a satisfaction in seeing another person grow through his guidance, and it reminded him that progress wasn't just personal, it could be shared. As the weeks went by, John noticed changes not just in his farm but in himself. He was no longer consumed by despair or the sense of being alone. The land was recovering, his routines were more structured, and his interactions with others brought him unexpected joy. Clara's words remained in his mind, a guiding light that reminded him to persist even in the hardest times. One afternoon, as he was checking the irrigation system, he noticed a figure approaching from the distance. At first he thought it was a traveler, but as the person came closer, his heart skipped a beat. It was Clara. She looked different, a little tired from the journey, but her smile was the same, warm and encouraging. "John," she said softly, "I was passing through and thought I would see how you're doing." John felt a rush of emotion. He wanted to say so many things at once: the progress he had made, the challenges he had overcome, the lessons he had learned. But all he could manage was a smile. Clara noticed the changes in him immediately. The farm looked healthier, the animals were well cared for, and John himself seemed more confident, less burdened by the weight of loneliness. "You've come a long way," she said. "I can see it in everything around you." They spent the evening together, sharing stories and observing the changes that had occurred since their first meeting. John realized that Clara's encouragement had been the spark, but it was his own determination and small, consistent actions that had truly transformed his life. By the time she left the next morning, John felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not only had he made progress on his farm and personal life, but he had also learned the importance of persistence, connection, and helping others. He now understood that even small steps, taken consistently, could lead to meaningful change. As he watched Clara disappear over the horizon, John turned back to his farm with renewed energy. There would be more challenges, no doubt, but he was ready to face them. Each day was a new opportunity to grow, to help others, and to embrace life fully, even when it was difficult. For the first time in many years, John felt hopeful about the future. He knew that hardships would come and go, but the lessons he had learned, and the connections he had made, would carry him through. Life was still hard, but it was no longer unbearable. With persistence, courage, and the support of others, he could continue to build a life worth living. And so, under the endless sky and surrounded by the land he loved, John worked, grew, and lived, carrying with him the simple but powerful truth: even when it hurts, don't stop. There is always a way forward, and often help comes when we least expect it. The days grew longer as winter began to fade, and spring slowly returned to the plains. John had learned to wake early, work diligently, and rest with purpose. His farm was thriving better than it had in years, and the lessons he had learned from Clara's encouragement guided him every step of the way. Yet, he knew that life was never simple. Just as he began to feel confident, new challenges appeared on the horizon. One morning, John awoke to the sound of heavy rain drumming against the roof of his small farmhouse. At first, it seemed like a welcome relief. The soil was dry, and the crops needed water. But soon, the rain grew stronger, turning into a steady downpour that lasted for hours. John went outside to check the fields and realized that the small creek that ran near the farm had begun to rise dangerously. If the water continued to grow, it could flood the lower fields and destroy the new crops he had planted. Without hesitation, John sprang into action. He ran to reinforce the banks of the creek with sandbags and moved tools, equipment, and small animals to higher ground. The rain was relentless, soaking him to the bone, but he refused to give up. Each hour felt longer than the last, but he persisted, thinking again of Clara's words. Keep going, even when it hurts. Don't stop. By evening, the rain began to slow, but the damage had been done. Some of the crops were ruined, and the mud made the fields almost impossible to navigate. John felt exhaustion wash over him. He could barely stand, yet he couldn't help but feel a quiet pride. He had faced the challenge head-on, and though the result wasn't perfect, he had prevented a much larger disaster. Small victories, he realized, were just as important as the big ones. The next few days were spent repairing the damage. John cleared the mud, replanted some of the crops, and worked with extra care to prevent future flooding. His muscles ached, and there were moments when despair tried to creep back in. But every time it did, he reminded himself of what he had learned. Persistence mattered more than perfection. Progress, no matter how slow, was still progress. As he worked, John also noticed how the community around him was beginning to change. Neighbors he had once only exchanged polite greetings with began stopping by to check on him after the storm. They brought supplies, offered advice, and shared small acts of kindness. For the first time, John realized that community wasn't just about physical proximity. It was about support, empathy, and shared effort. One of the neighbors, a woman named Mary, approached him one morning carrying a basket of fresh bread. "John," she said kindly, "I heard about the flooding. You've been working hard. You should take a moment to rest." John shook his head. "I can't. There's still so much to fix, but thank you for the bread." Mary smiled. "Sometimes resting is part of the work. You can't pour from an empty cup." Her words struck John in a way similar to Clara's. He realized he had been so focused on physical labor and survival that he had neglected his own well-being. He began taking short breaks, eating properly, and allowing himself moments of reflection. In these quiet moments, he would sit by the creek or under the trees, thinking about what he had accomplished and what he still wanted to achieve. One day, while tending to the animals, John noticed a group of travelers passing by on the road. They were struggling to push a broken wagon through the mud, their horses exhausted and wet. Without hesitation, John ran to help. Together, they managed to free the wagon and guide the horses to a nearby stable. The travelers, grateful for his help, offered him supplies in return: flour, seeds, and tools that would make his farm work easier. Helping others became a new part of John's life. Each act, no matter how small, reminded him that human connection was not a one-way street. Giving support and receiving it were intertwined. It gave him a sense of purpose beyond his own farm, something that brought a quiet joy he hadn't felt in years. But life was not all progress and calm. One afternoon, as John repaired a section of fence, he heard frantic shouting from across the fields. He ran to see what was happening and found Tom, the young boy he had been teaching, trapped under a fallen branch while trying to herd some sheep. John rushed to lift the branch and free him. Tom was shaken but unharmed. John hugged the boy tightly, feeling a mixture of relief and fear. It was moments like these that reminded him of the fragility of life and how quickly circumstances could change. That evening, John sat by the fire, reflecting on the events of the day. He thought about the rain, the flood, the travelers, and Tom's accident. Life had a way of testing him, often in ways that were unpredictable. But he also realized that each test was an opportunity to grow, to learn patience, resilience, and compassion. He felt grateful for the lessons, and for the small successes that reminded him he was capable of more than he had believed. As the weeks passed, the farm flourished. The crops grew tall and healthy, the animals thrived, and even the fences and buildings showed signs of careful maintenance. John had transformed not just the physical space, but also the way he approached life. He was more organized, more mindful, and more connected to the people around him. His loneliness, which had once felt permanent, was gradually replaced by meaningful relationships and a renewed sense of purpose. One day, while walking through the fields, John noticed Clara again. She had returned, this time staying for several days. She spoke with John about the changes she had seen, and he proudly showed her the improvements he had made to the farm. But it wasn't just the physical changes that impressed her. It was the calm confidence in his voice, the thoughtful way he approached problems, and the quiet joy he now carried within him. "You've grown so much," Clara said softly. "I can see it in your work, your eyes, and your spirit." John smiled, humbled by her words. "I've had help, guidance, and moments of reflection. I couldn't have done it alone." Clara nodded. "That's the truth. Growth is never truly solitary. We all need people who remind us to keep going, even when it's hard." During her stay, Clara and John spent time repairing old structures, planting additional crops, and even building a small greenhouse to protect young plants from future storms. They laughed, shared stories, and worked side by side. For John, it was not just the physical labor that was rewarding, but the companionship, the feeling that someone understood him and shared in the journey of rebuilding life. One afternoon, John received a letter from a nearby town, inviting him to a regional farming meeting. The meeting would discuss new techniques, market opportunities, and ways to collaborate with other farmers. At first, John hesitated, unsure if he was ready to step into a wider community. But Clara encouraged him, saying, "You've faced more than most. This is another chance to learn and grow. Don't miss it." With her encouragement, John attended the meeting. He was nervous at first, but soon found himself engaged in discussions, asking questions and sharing his own experiences. He realized that he had valuable insights to offer, and that others were genuinely interested in his perspective. The experience boosted his confidence and reinforced the idea that he could contribute meaningfully beyond the confines of his farm. As spring turned to summer, John faced yet another test. A severe heat wave threatened the crops and animals. Temperatures soared and water became scarce. Yet John did not despair. He carefully managed irrigation, rationed water for the animals, and used creative solutions to protect the most vulnerable plants. His persistence paid off. Though not all crops survived, the majority thrived, and his careful planning prevented major losses. Through these trials, John came to understand an important truth. Life would always be unpredictable, sometimes harsh, but facing it with resilience, careful thought, and determination made all the difference. Challenges were not just obstacles, they were opportunities to grow stronger and wiser. By the end of Part 3, John had transformed significantly. He had become not just a man who survived, but a man who thrived through persistence, connection, and purpose. He had faced floods, storms, accidents, and the isolation of his lonely life, yet each challenge had strengthened him. Clara's words, the help of neighbors, and his own determination had combined to build a life that was more fulfilling than he could have imagined. He now looked forward to the future, not with fear but with quiet confidence. He had learned that even when life hurts, even when the road seems impossible, moving forward step by step, asking for help when needed, and offering support in return created a life worth living. And so, as the summer sun shone over the plains and the fields flourished with new life, John stood tall, ready for whatever came next. He had discovered the enduring truth that had carried him through every struggle. Persistence, courage, and connection could transform even the hardest of lives into something rich, meaningful, and full of hope. Summer had settled fully over the plains. The days were long, the sun strong, and the crops that John had planted earlier in the year were beginning to show the promise of a good harvest. He had grown confident in his abilities and careful in his planning, but life had a way of reminding him that no matter how prepared he was, surprises could come at any time. One morning, John awoke to a loud banging at the door. When he opened it, he found a messenger from the town looking worried. "Mr. John," the man said, "a fire has broken out at the barn on the edge of town. It's spreading quickly and the townspeople are struggling to control it. We could use your help." John's heart sank. Fires were one of the greatest dangers to farmers and ranchers, destroying months of hard work in a single day. But without hesitation, he grabbed his hat, boots, and a bucket and mounted his horse. As he rode toward the town, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing on him. This would be a test like no other, a challenge that could not be solved by careful planning alone. When he arrived, the scene was chaotic. Flames leapt high into the sky, smoke filled the air, and the heat was intense. Neighbors were forming human chains, passing buckets of water, trying desperately to save what they could. John immediately joined them, his hands steady despite the heat. He remembered all the lessons he had learned: persistence, patience, teamwork, and the importance of staying calm under pressure. The fire raged for hours. At one point, it seemed as though nothing could be saved. John felt exhaustion clawing at him, sweat stinging his eyes and his arms aching from the effort. For a moment, fear crept in, whispering that all their work might be destroyed, but he pushed the thought aside. He focused on the task at hand, coordinating with the others, ensuring that water was passed efficiently, and keeping spirits high with words of encouragement. Clara arrived in the midst of the chaos, carrying extra supplies. Seeing her gave John a surge of determination. She did not offer instructions or praise. She simply stood beside him, working tirelessly. Together, they formed an unspoken rhythm, moving through the turmoil with careful precision. The combination of teamwork, perseverance, and strategy slowly began to turn the tide. Small victories appeared. A section of the barn was saved, some of the hay was moved to safety, and the fire, though still dangerous, was starting to burn out in places. By late afternoon, the fire was under control. Exhausted, covered in soot, and feeling the ache in every muscle, John finally stepped back and looked at what had been saved. Not everything had survived, but the majority of the property and animals were safe. The townspeople gathered around, expressing gratitude and relief. John, for the first time in weeks, allowed himself to feel a deep sense of pride. He had faced one of the greatest challenges of his life and had not given up. That evening, as the town recovered from the fire, John and Clara walked together toward the small river that ran near the town. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the water. John felt a deep sense of peace, a rare moment where he could breathe and reflect. "I never imagined I could handle something like today," he said quietly. "It was terrifying but also somehow empowering." Clara smiled. "That's the strength you've been building all along." Life tests us, sometimes in ways we cannot predict, and today you proved to yourself that you can rise to the challenge. John nodded. He thought about all the struggles he had faced over the past months, the storms, the floods, the accidents, and the loneliness. Each had seemed overwhelming in the moment, but each had taught him lessons he could carry forward. He realized that the fire was not just about saving property. It was a culmination of everything he had learned about persistence, resilience, and community. The next morning, John returned to his farm with a renewed sense of purpose. The fire had reminded him of the fragility of life, but also of the importance of preparation, vigilance, and teamwork. He spent the following weeks repairing damaged structures, reinforcing fences, and reorganizing his fields. Each task was approached with care and thought, and John felt a deep satisfaction in seeing tangible results from his efforts. Tom continued to work by his side, learning not just about farming, but about resilience and problem-solving. John taught him how to anticipate problems, plan for emergencies, and stay calm when unexpected challenges arose. The boy soaked up every lesson, and in return, his energy and enthusiasm lifted John's spirits. The farm had become more than just a livelihood. It was a place of learning, growth, and shared purpose. One afternoon, John received news from a neighboring town. They were hosting a regional fair to celebrate agriculture, innovation, and community achievement. The fair included competitions for best crops, livestock, and creative solutions for farming challenges. John hesitated. He had never thought of entering such competitions, feeling that his work was private, personal, and unworthy of attention. But Clara encouraged him once more. "You've done incredible work," she said. "Sharing it might inspire others, and it could be a way to celebrate everything you've accomplished." With her encouragement, John decided to enter the fair. He prepared carefully, selecting his best produce, showing off the healthier livestock, and documenting some of the techniques he had developed to manage challenges like droughts, floods, and storms. When he arrived at the fair, he was nervous, unsure how others would view his work. But as he walked through the exhibits, he realized something important. The fair was not about competition alone. It was about sharing knowledge, learning from others, and celebrating community achievements. The judges and other farmers were impressed by John's work. They asked questions about his methods, admired his crops, and noted the careful way he cared for his animals. For John, this recognition was not just about winning. It was validation that his persistence, careful planning, and willingness to grow had paid off. When the results were announced, he had won a prize for innovation in small-scale farming. The applause was humbling, and for a moment he felt a surge of emotion he had not felt in years. Returning home from the fair, John reflected on his journey. From the lonely cowboy who struggled with isolation and despair, he had become a man capable of facing adversity, learning from experiences, and helping others along the way. The fire, the floods, and the storms were not just challenges. They were opportunities for growth, each teaching him resilience, patience, and courage. Clara stayed with him for several more days, helping to organize the farm, plant new seeds, and teach new methods to Tom. Their bond had grown, not out of romance, but out of mutual respect, understanding, and shared effort. She had been the spark that reminded John of his potential, but the change had come from within him, the persistence, hard work, and willingness to embrace help when needed. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, John stood at the top of a small hill overlooking his farm. The fields were green and thriving, the animals were content, and the structures were repaired and improved. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not just in what he had accomplished, but in the journey itself. Life had not been easy, but he had learned to face challenges, accept help, and share his knowledge and strength with others. He thought of the people who had supported him along the way: Clara, Tom, Mary, Henry, and the neighbors who had helped after the fire and floods. He realized that no one truly succeeds alone. Growth, resilience, and joy were intertwined with the connections we make and the kindness we offer and receive. As the first stars appeared in the evening sky, John smiled. The journey had been long, filled with obstacles, doubts, and moments of despair, but it had also been full of learning, growth, and human connection. He understood now that life would always have challenges, but with courage, persistence, and the support of others, even the hardest paths could lead to fulfillment and joy. John turned toward the farmhouse, where Tom was tending to the animals, humming a cheerful tune. He felt a sense of pride in the young boy's progress, knowing that the lessons he had learned would continue through someone else. The farm was more than a place of work. It was a place of hope, learning, and life. Clara, seeing John's content expression, spoke softly. "You've built something remarkable here, not just a farm, but a life filled with purpose and connection." John nodded, grateful for her guidance and the journey he had undertaken. "I've learned that persistence matters," he said, "that even when life hurts, we don't stop, and that help, kindness, and connection can make even the hardest journey possible." The night fell quietly over the plains, calm and peaceful. The challenges of the past, the storms, the fire, the isolation, were still part of his story, but they no longer defined him. John had discovered the power of resilience, community, and the quiet strength that comes from facing life fully, one step at a time. And so, under the vast sky and surrounded by the land he loved, John continued his journey, not alone, but connected, prepared, and hopeful. He had learned the greatest lesson of all, that life's hardships were not the end, but the beginning of growth, and that the path forward, though sometimes difficult, was always worth taking.